Autumn draped over Hollow Creek like a thin copper shawl shimmering in the breeze. Beneath the wide-open sky and the dusty ground, the livestock auction was slowly inching toward the most unusual moment in its entire history. None of the ranchers, traders, or townsfolk of this small corner of the world could have guessed that on that day, amid the scent of dry straw and the bleating of calves gone hoarse, a voice, deep and sharp as steel, would slice through the air and freeze the entire grandstand into silence. $1 million, declared Benedict Cross, his voice echoing across the arena. To anyone in this godforsaken place who can get that dog to sit quietly beside them for 5 minutes. He stood tall, a large figure in a perfectly tailored black suit, a silver tie glinting like a blade in the light, his chiseled face cold and unreadable, eyes devoid of even a flicker of emotion. Below the stands, a rusted iron cage sat isolated, as if even it had been exiled from the rest of the world. Inside the cage was Ghost. The German shepherd spoke of only in hushed tones. His body was powerful yet gaunt, his coat, once the pride of a working breed, now matted with dry mud, tangled and torn. His ears stood erect, taut with tension, his pale gray eyes sharp as cut stone, and that stare pierced through anyone who dared meet it, as though seeing straight into their bones. He didn't bark like ordinary dogs in panic. He growled, a low, damp sound that seemed to rise from the deepest part of his throat, dragging out endlessly like a warning. Muscles beneath his thinning fur were drawn tight as bowstrings, his back lowered, legs coiled and ready to spring if anyone was foolish enough to come close. Each breath pulsed like a countdown to a fury long suppressed, and the scars along his legs, ribs, and hips whispered of stories never told. The audience, already abuzz from rumors of the untamable beast, now silently retreated. Men who had broken wild stallions and stared down raging bulls now kept behind the railings, refusing even to pretend they could approach. Even celebrity animal trainers, those who talked to dogs on TV, stayed put. Ghost wasn't just dangerous. He was broken. Not broken in a mechanical or instinctual way, but in a place where memory can't heal. His eyes did not gleam with madness, but with a despair so deeply taught it had become obedient. This was a dog that no longer believed in human hands, because too many times those hands had come bearing chains, shock rods, and orders that never made sense. Benedict smirked, though the smile never reached his eyes. "Bring him out," he said, his voice over the microphone cracking like judgment. "Let's see what loyalty looks like when there's no collar and no leash." 2 handlers stepped forward, wearing thick gloves and carrying steel-looped catch poles, not the kind used for dogs, but for wild animals. They opened the cage slowly, and Ghost shot out like an arrow loosed from a drawn bow. A rope, tied tightly to a wooden post embedded deep in the gravel floor, yanked him back, but just short of choking him. Dust flared. His growl roared. No one dared take a step closer. Phones went up, but no one smiled. No applause, no cheers. No one crossed the invisible line between them and this growling creature that seemed to carry inside him every betrayal the world had ever dealt. At that moment, something like tragedy drifted into the atmosphere. Besides the physical rope restraining him, there was a clearer tether, braided from betrayal, humiliation, and cries that were never answered. It was that unseen leash that kept Ghost bound to himself. This dog did not need to be reshaped into a manageable version. What he needed wasn't domination, but a presence quiet enough to reach the wounded part of his heart no one had ever really listened to. And yet, among the hundreds of eyes fixed on him that day, not one saw that. Not until a little girl stepped forward, not with a leash, but with the only thing left that Ghost might still believe in. As the air in the Hollow Creek arena thickened with wordless tension, and Ghost's low growl seemed to scrape the spines of everyone watching, a movement so quiet it was nearly missed began to spread like a thin breath through the space. Clara Thompson, a small girl with a frame as soft as morning mist, stepped off the grandstand. She walked into the circle of dusty gravel, territory no one had dared set foot in since Ghost had been pulled from his rusted cage. No one stopped her, not because they didn't want to, but because they couldn't believe what they were seeing. A few murmurs rose like ripples. "Who is that girl? What's she doing? Someone stop her!" But the voices stayed hushed because her presence, fragile as it was, carried something no one dared interrupt. Maybe it was purity, maybe an odd courage, or maybe it was the fact that no one had ever approached Ghost without an agenda. Clara wore an earth-colored quilted coat, her hair tied loosely with a frayed fabric bow and old sneakers stained with dirt. Her face held no crease of worry, no trace of panic. Not even the fear a child should feel standing before a snarling German shepherd. Her face was round, her eyes large and gleaming, not challenging, not analyzing, but carrying a light no one could look away from. The quiet shine of a child who never rushes, never forces anyone to understand her, only hopes someone will be patient enough to see she's there, watching, listening. Inside her coat pocket, Clara's hand gripped an old harmonica, the only thing she had left of her mother, the woman who had devoted her life to listening to creatures others deemed untrainable. Eliza Hayes didn't believe in whips, collars, or fear-based obedience. She believed in music, in breath, in eye contact, and in the resilience of hearts that seemed shattered beyond repair. After the fire 2 years ago that took her away, the weathered harmonica remained Clara's constant companion, like her mother's whisper, tucked deep in the part of her heart even the world couldn't touch. Clara didn't need anyone to tell her to step forward. No one encouraged her, and certainly no one expected her to. She simply saw Ghost, and something in his eyes made it impossible for her to stay seated. Maybe it was the loneliness, maybe it was the helplessness, or maybe it was because, in a world where no one fully understood Clara, she recognized another being no one had ever truly understood. Ghost stood there, not restrained by a rope, but by memory. The faint scars beneath his filthy coat, the sharp flinches whenever anyone drew near, the ever-alert ears though no commands came. Clara saw them all, not with her eyes, but with the sense some call a special instinct that certain children carry. When she was 5 steps away, Ghost growled again. A lower rumble, not loud, but enough to startle several spectators. A woman clutching her baby pulled back. Clara's grandmother, Miriam, stood frozen at the railing, lips moving with words she couldn't voice. But Clara didn't stop. She slowly pulled the harmonica from her pocket. A small thing faded with age, its corners scratched bare of plating. On the worn metal face, 3 initials remained faintly etched. E.H., Eliza Hayes. Clara didn't look at anyone. She only looked at Ghost, then dipped her head gently, as if greeting someone who couldn't speak back. And then, with all the reverence one could give to a sacred keepsake, she raised the harmonica to her lips. No one dared breathe. Ghost, taut on the rope and ready to lunge, suddenly stilled. His ears perked. His tense body slackened slightly. His eyes didn't leave the girl. The music hadn't yet begun. Only Clara's breath, and a silence that cracked open for just one small moment. A first moment where a dog thought to be beyond saving and a girl the world had misunderstood reached each other through something no one in that crowd could see. And at the edge of that auction ring, the edge of a place where animals are bought, sold, measured, and priced, a connection had just taken root, not through training, but through trust. And then, in the space frozen by fear and prejudice, a sound as delicate as morning mist touched the earth, breaking softly into the wind-chilled autumn afternoon. It wasn't a signal drum or a call to action. It was the first notes breathed into life by the faded harmonica on Clara's lips. A sound not born of command, but of unspoken trust. The melody wasn't recognizable. It wasn't perfect, not on beat, sometimes blown astray by the breeze. But in its very imperfection, it carried something raw and honest, so much so that even the wind seemed to pause to listen. Ghost stood still. No growling, no lunging. His eyes, no longer hard as steel, began to soften, as if a tiny door had opened behind the mist of vigilance. His ears perked, facing the sound, not with aggression, but with a quiet searching, as if digging through memory for something long lost. A whisper rippled through the crowd, like wind brushing tall grass. He's listening. Ghost took a step. A single, heavy step, as if testing limbs that hadn't dared move closer to anyone in years. Then he stopped, the rope between his collar and the iron post loosening, not because someone slackened it, but because he was beginning to ease himself out of fear. Clara kept playing, her breath steady, her rhythm unhurried. She wasn't trying to make music. She was telling a story only two misunderstood souls could truly hear from each other. Ghost took another step. No one dared to disturb the moment. Even Benedict Cross, who had stood rigid as stone, now leaned slightly forward, his eyes narrowing in confusion, as if unable to grasp why this was happening, why the creature he had long called a resistant monster was retreating from the edge of rage, not by force, but by a humble tune played by a girl no one believed in. When Ghost stopped, he was exactly 1 arm's length away from Clara. His breath stirred the fine dust beneath the tilted light. His body relaxed, tail lowered, not out of fear, not out of submission, but in a quiet, voluntary presence. And then, under hundreds of wide, silent eyes, Ghost sat down, not by command, not by a leash, not even with a flicker of hesitation. He sat the way only those who have endured, waited and longed for a moment of trust can sit. That posture said nothing of surrender to power, but everything about surrendering wariness to something that felt, for once, safe, something that made resisting the world no longer necessary. Clara stopped playing. There was no final note, and in that pause, where every noise once thunderous had fallen away, it was the silence itself that moved people most. Ghost remained still, unshaken, unmoving. Minutes passed, or maybe it was only seconds. No one knew. No one cared to count. In the face of a miracle born of patience and wordless compassion, even time had lost its grip. Benedict Cross did not move, his face strained with disbelief. This man, who had led hundreds of dogs into arenas, who once commanded entire security forces with a single word, now stood before a truth he could not deny. Some things cannot be conquered. They can only be trusted. And the one forcing him to face that truth was a girl the world had deemed incapable of understanding. Ghost didn't move again. Neither did Clara. They simply sat beside each other. A dog once turned into a tool, and a girl never seen as a guide. Yet in that moment, they were living proof of something so simple it cut deep. Not everyone needs training to know how to love, and sometimes even silence has a voice, if we are patient enough to hear it. And then, as if time itself held its breath to see what would happen next, Clara lowered the harmonica, leaving behind a silence thick with meaning. Not the chill of fear, nor the weight of doubt, but a silence shaped by something sacred, understanding without words. Ghost still sat, unmoving, like a living statue. But if one looked closer, they'd see his tail had relaxed, his breath no longer quick and shallow. His ears no longer stood sharp with tension, but leaned gently toward the only person who hadn't tried to force him to bow. His silver-gray eyes no longer burned with anger. Now, they were still, like a lake after rain, reflecting the figure of a small but resolute soul quietly approaching. Clara took another step, then another. Her canvas shoes brushed over the dry earth, still bearing the trembling footprints of those who had once tried and failed to come close. But her steps carried no caution. They were not the steps of someone overcoming fear. They were the steps of someone who had never seen this creature through the lens of fear to begin with. Behind the fence, her grandmother, Miriam Thompson, gripped the wooden rail as if she'd shatter without it. Her eyes followed Clara's back with a tidal mix of emotion, not just worry or awe, but something far more familiar. As if, in that small girl's stance, she saw a long-lost echo of someone she once knew. Eliza, her daughter. Clara's mother. When Clara stopped, she was no more than 2 arms' length from Ghost. No one breathed, all eyes locked on the dog, waiting for the explosion. But it never came. Instead, Ghost tilted his head, eyes meeting Clara's as if asking, "Who are you to come this close without fear?" And the answer, unspoken, was in the quiet gentleness of her gaze, the steadiness of her stance, and the small hand still holding the harmonica, like it held a fragment of the past. "I'm taking him home." Her voice wasn't loud, but in the dense silence of the arena, it rang clearer than any announcement ever broadcast from the loudspeakers. Clara didn't shout, didn't ask permission. She simply said it, as if it had been decided long ago before they even met. Miriam heard her granddaughter's words, and did not object. She didn't ask why, or are you sure? Something in Clara's voice told her this was not a child's whim. It was a promise. Simple, deep, and unbreakable. Ghost tilted his head toward Clara, then slowly stood. No command, no tug on the leash, no signal, no reward. Only something ancient, maybe memory, maybe instinct, maybe what humans call faith, had just reawakened in the heart of a dog whose childhood had been stolen. He stepped toward Clara, each footfall quiet as mist. Not tight at her heel like a trained pet, not shrinking like the shamed, but walking the way one returns to a place they've never truly known, but always needed. And so, in front of a crowd that once saw him as a threat, beneath the eyes of those who once shook their heads and said, "That girl doesn't understand," Ghost walked beside Clara, not dragged, not leashed, simply with her. Behind them, Benedict Cross stood frozen, his face a mask of cold. Pride wouldn't let him show anger, but what unfolded before him stripped away something power could never restore. His credibility, unraveled by a child, and worse still, by a dog he had once declared too far gone to ever be broken again. His entourage remained silent. Those who had laughed when Clara stepped into the ring now looked down. Some raised their phones to film, then lowered them again, as if fearing that recording something so beautiful might make it disappear. Clara walked off the auction floor. Ghost followed. No one stopped them. No one asked for papers. No one made an offer. Because numbers no longer mattered. Not after everyone had witnessed this. A dog had chosen freedom. And for the first time since everything, he had chosen it by walking with someone he trusted. When the wooden gate finally closed behind them, sealing off the echoes of the Hollow Creek auction, none of the 3 people, and 1 creature, who left that place knew they were stepping not into an ending, but into the beginning of a long, quiet journey with no map. Thompson Farm, nestled along the southern edge of Sage Valley, was neither large nor modern, but it carried something no other place could offer. The gentle silence of things once broken, now being carefully put back together. The roof, shingled with weather-darkened wood, had aged in the wind. The backyard still held the scent of last year's wild lavender. And on the front porch, the old rocking chair remained, the very one Eliza, Miriam's daughter, had once sat in for hours, listening to the wind sweep through the grass and the distant hooves echoing from neighboring pastures. Ghost stopped at the first step. He didn't growl, didn't lunge, but he didn't go further. His body froze for a moment. His front paws halted just shy of the porch's edge, close enough to touch the sunlight spilling from inside, but not close enough to cross the line between outside and inside, a line that, for a dog who had been hurt at every doorway, stretched as wide as a chasm. Clara said nothing. She simply sat on the second step, her old harmonica resting quietly in the thick pocket of her coat. The breeze played gently with her hair, wrapping around the silence that didn't need to be broken. After a while, Ghost lay down, not closer, not further, eyes fixed on Clara. He chose to keep his distance in the only way that felt safe to him. That first night on the farm, Ghost didn't sleep in the kennel. He didn't go inside the house either. Clara had laid out a soft blanket under the porch, beside a clean water bowl and a dish filled with food. But Ghost didn't eat. He lay still, a shadow beneath the steps, his ears alert, his eyes open all night, never relaxing. The clinking of metal in the kitchen as Miriam washed dishes made him flinch, his shoulders tightening like he'd been struck. The soft slam of a wind-blown door made his entire body shrink, legs clenched, tail tucked tight beneath him, as if one more sound might cause him to shatter. The next morning, when Clara came out early, Ghost was still there, still unfed, still outside, but still there. That alone was its small miracle. No one called for him, no one dragged him, but he had chosen not to leave. And for a creature once treated as nothing more than a tool, that unforced presence was the first step toward trust. The next day, Clara tried placing the food bowl beneath the old oak in the yard, a shaded spot far from the house where no clanging metal could reach. She left the bowl there and walked away without looking back. That afternoon, when she came to collect it, it was empty. No praise, no head pats, no good boy, but in Clara's heart, it rang like the first note in the song of healing. That evening, Ghost still didn't step onto the porch, but he didn't lie with his back turned like the night before. He lay on his side, eyes still open, but no longer wild with panic. He looked toward the doorway, where the warm glow of a lamp flickered gently, where Clara sat cross-legged on the living room floor, rereading her mother's old letters, still inked in fading brown, still scented with eucalyptus oil Eliza had once used to soothe frightened horses. Clara didn't try to change Ghost. She didn't coax. She didn't call. She didn't inch closer. She simply was there, as if all she wanted to say was, "When you're ready, I'll still be here." And Ghost, in his way, answered. He no longer flinched at the sight of Miriam through the window. He didn't shrink when he heard the spoon clink against the bowl. When Clara stepped into the yard, he didn't retreat, but he didn't approach either. He kept his distance, but always within sight. And that distance, day by day, morning by dewy morning, afternoon by golden-sunned afternoon, began to shrink, not through action, but through breath, the only truth that never lies. Miriam, who watched every motion from the porch with a cooling cup of tea in hand, whispered to herself one quiet night, "He's not afraid of Clara, not even a little." And that, more than any leash or command, was the first foundation of healing, not forged by control, but by presence without demand. Late autumn mornings at Thompson Farm always began in stillness, not the suffocating stillness of loneliness, nor the brittle silence of cold, but a warm kind of quiet, just enough for the most fragile things to breathe. In that quiet, Clara sat reading her mother's books on the porch. Ghost lay a few paces away beneath the oak tree, and Miriam moved soundlessly in the kitchen, steeping tea. 3 lives careful and small, as if all 3 were protecting a fragile world they didn't dare disturb. And then, she arrived. Dr. Clara Monroe's silver-gray pickup rolled softly onto the dirt road leading to the farm on a Tuesday morning. No horn, no dust kicked up. Even the engine seemed to muffle itself between the tree lines. Just like her, a woman who had spent her life among creatures that couldn't speak, and who had, because of that, learned to enter their world without stirring it. Clara Monroe, nearly 70, still wore her gray hair neatly clipped in a silver leaf-shaped pin. Her eyes weren't sharp, weren't stern, but always deep. There was nothing she hadn't seen. But what earned her respect wasn't her knowledge. It was her patience, so profound that even the most fearful creatures began to settle in her presence. On her first visit, she didn't walk toward Ghost. didn't ask about his condition, didn't offer any advice. She simply sat on the porch beside Clara and Miriam, pulling from a woven basket an old thermos, and poured 3 cups of tea, 1 for Clara, 1 for Miriam, 1 for herself. Ghost, lying under the oak over 10 meters away, lifted his head slightly, ears twitching. She noticed, but didn't turn. Instead, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small paper package, unwrapping a soft oat biscuit. She broke it in half. 1 half she gave to Clara, the other she placed quietly beside her boot. No words, no expectations. Then she pulled a worn book from her coat pocket, its cover frayed, spine patched with tape. A handwritten veterinary journal, probably from her earliest years in practice. She flipped to a page and began to read aloud in her steady, low voice. No one knew who she was reading to, but Ghost looked in that direction. Didn't approach, didn't run. In the mornings that followed, Dr. Monroe returned, always at dawn, when dew still kissed the grass, when Clara and Ghost had already found their places. She brought food, sometimes oat biscuits, sometimes peanut butter, sometimes slices of roasted liver, but never offered it by hand. She scattered it along the dirt path leading to the oak tree, like dropping the letters of an unspoken message. Then she turned away, sat down, read, closed her eyes, or simply sipped her tea. Ghost didn't move, but by the next morning, the food was always gone. On the 5th day, she brought a brush. She didn't walk toward Ghost, but when she finished reading, she placed the brush on the porch step, not hidden, but not obvious either. Then she sat and combed her hair, slow, gentle strokes, as if inviting Ghost's memory to recall a time when a touch that soft had once crossed his back. Ghost watched, and for the first time he stood, only on his front legs, only to change position, but no longer rooted like before. His body is still tense, his tail is still low, but his gaze no longer dodged. He was beginning to accept her presence. Miriam, watching from the kitchen window, didn't say a word. She just watched, eyes misting with a quiet ache she didn't name. Something about the way Clara and Monroe approached the dog stirred a memory she hadn't allowed herself to revisit. A vision of Eliza, long ago, sitting beside a horse with a shattered leg no one believed could walk again. Eliza hadn't commanded. She hadn't been treated. She hadn't pleaded. She had simply stayed, and the horse had lived. On the 7th day, Monroe sat closer, only about 4 meters away. She didn't reach out, didn't make eye contact. She simply read, this time from a page she had copied years ago from Eliza Hayes' journal during a case at the Hayes farm. You don't touch a wounded creature with your hand. You touch it by never asking it to be anything other than what it is. Ghost lay with his head tilted, and when Monroe left, he lifted his head. Not to watch, but to remember. For the first time, someone had been soft enough, real enough, patient enough not to make him recoil. That evening, Clara walked out onto the porch carrying the cloth Monroe had left the day before, a thick piece embroidered with a tiny branch in one corner, still faintly scented with dried mint. She placed it at the base of the oak, then stepped back. Ghost came forward, not to eat, not to bark, not to whine. He lay down on that cloth, turned in a circle, and curled up, as if, for the first time after years of carrying tension in every vertebra, he was allowing himself to relax, even just for one night, and one night was enough to begin the change. That morning, dawn unfurled over the valley like a silver blanket laid gently across dew-laced blades of grass. The world was so quiet you could hear the wind brushing past the eaves, the soft clatter of dry branches swaying in the backyard, and from somewhere in the kitchen, the faint scent of mint rising from the tea Miriam was preparing for her usual guest, Dr. Clara Monroe. Ghost was no longer lying behind the shadow of the oak tree. Today he sat on the porch, head lowered slightly, gaze no longer evasive, but still deep, like water shaded by moss, still and ancient. Since the day he arrived at Thompson Farm, every change in him, how he moved, how he reacted to sound, to people, had been so subtle and small that only the keenest observer might notice. But Monroe did. She watched every breath, every twitch of an ear, every silent flinch. And perhaps because of that silence, Ghost chose this day to allow it. Monroe sat on the porch, unhurried, without reaching out. She placed her soft gloves beside her, a tray of roasted liver pieces divided neatly, and a book opened halfway, as though she had come not to take control, but simply to be present. Ghost stepped forward, not fast, not urgent. Each step seemed like it was retracing old memories, each one an echo of electric jolts, shouted commands, or hands that grabbed and squeezed without kindness. But this time, there was no leash, no metallic snap of a lock, just an old woman sitting still, palms resting on her thighs, and eyes that never looked directly at him. When Ghost came close, Monroe slowly put her gloves back on. Her hand moved, not from above toward his head like so many do when petting a dog, but from the side, slipping gently beneath his chest, laying her palm softly against his right side, where the fur had thinned significantly. Ghost flinched slightly, his shoulders recoiling, breath held tight in his ribs. But he didn't run. Monroe didn't move her hand. She just left it there, warm, steady, not forcing anything. One heartbeat, then another, and when Ghost finally began to exhale again, she carefully moved her fingers along his side. Underneath the glove, she felt what no medical exam was needed to confirm. Scars. Not scratches or bites from nature, scars from cords, from heat, from electroshock training devices. And not just one, but many. Some had formed atop others, layers where the old hadn't yet healed before the new arrived. Some were hard, like wire under the skin, running from his belly to his neck. She found one just behind his left ear, where the skin had thickened into a leathery patch, almost numb, a dead zone, of both nerve and memory. "My God," she whispered, perhaps aloud, without meaning to. Ghost didn't growl, he didn't move, but his eyes closed, and in that gesture there was a surrender, not to her but to himself, as if by allowing someone to see the wounds, he had finally admitted, "I was hurt, deeply, and for real." Monroe withdrew her hand, removed her gloves, rested them in her lap. She stayed silent for a long moment before turning to Clara, who had been standing just inside the door, gripping her mother's old notebook tightly. "He wasn't trained to be a dog," Monroe said softly. "He was trained to be a weapon." The words fell like a blade into the silence. Not to shock, but to expose a long-buried truth. Clara didn't speak. She sat down beside Ghost, not touching him, just watching. Watching with eyes never taught by classrooms, but carrying the quiet sorrow only those who've truly loved animals can feel. The grief for what could have been, had someone chosen kindness instead. Miriam came out with a tray of tea. She didn't ask questions, but when she saw the way Ghost now lay, his body loose, legs stretched to one side, eyes closed, she knew. He had shown his wounds, and he had chosen to stay. Monroe said nothing more. She sipped her tea, opened her book, and then closed it again, gazing out toward the fields where morning sunlight spilled like honey. She thought of all the dogs who had lost their softness from being taught to bite rather than stay, of training centers that preached discipline while spreading terror to the roots. Then she looked at Clara. The girl sat still beside Ghost, her hand resting open on the floor, not touching, but near enough that, if he wanted, he could lay his head there. And Monroe understood. All the techniques in the world couldn't match the quiet decency of a moment that asked for nothing in return. Night fell over Sage Valley in the faint blur of a crescent moon suspended above the willow trees. The wind whispered across the porch like someone softly speaking into an ear. And Ghost, once forged into something weaponized, slept just outside the door, not curled tight like a fist ready for betrayal, but gently sprawled for the first time, as if sleep was safe. The whole house seemed to hold its breath, listening to something it couldn't yet name. Clara sat quietly in the living room, hands clasped, eyes fixed on Ghost resting peacefully outside. She had never imagined she'd see this day, the day a creature like Ghost could breathe without fear, even for a moment. And then, as if tugged by an invisible thread, Clara rose. She said nothing, called no one. She walked straight to the wooden door at the end of the hallway, her mother's room, Eliza Hayes's room. The room had remained untouched since her mother passed. Miriam dusted it weekly, kept the bedding clean, and changed the dried flowers in the ash-glazed ceramic vase. Clara hadn't stepped inside for months. But tonight, after Ghost had let someone touch his scars without fleeing, she knew she was ready to open the door she had kept shut inside her heart. It opened softly, like a breath. Everything was still there. The cotton-cushioned reading chair, the raw wood desk with the handmade inkwell, the shelves packed with old books on animal behavior and training philosophies from decades past. But what Clara sought wasn't on the shelves. She went to the lowest drawer, the one her mother had used to store unfinished notes and private reflections. And there it was. Among the old pages, she found a moss-green leather notebook. Just touching it, she felt the time wore into it, corners soft from folding, the spine wrinkled like the back of an old hand, and from its pages rose the scent of eucalyptus and mint. Her mother's oils used to calm the most anxious of animals. Clara held the book in both hands, as if cradling a piece of her mother's heart. She sat on the bed, not rushing to open it, just letting it rest in her lap, sacred and still. Outside, Ghost shifted slightly on the porch, the sound so light it could have been the wind. When she finally opened the first page, moonlight caught the angle just enough to reveal her mother's handwriting. Brown-red ink, gently slanted, strong and fluid. Between the notes were simple sketches: the bowed head of a dog, an open hand, a diagram of a collar labeled "Never tighten more than 2 fingers," arrows indicating approach distances, and pencil markings along the margins, as if her mother had edited her thoughts after each real-world encounter. Clara turned to page 13 and froze. A single line, framed in soft pencil strokes. Trust begins in the quiet. Below it, her mother had written, not as a theory, but like a conversation. Not in commands, not from rewards or fear. It begins in the moment both humans and animals choose to stay. No conditions, no demands. Clara read each word slowly, letting it seep into her chest like a second kind of breath. The same breath Ghost had found again this morning when he let Monroe's hand touch the scar. She turned the page. Her mother had written about animals trained through fear. Force creates silence, but silence is not understanding. And a creature that obeys out of fear is not obedient, just broken more efficiently. Clara felt the sting in her nose. She closed the notebook gently, but didn't move. She sat there, watching moonlight glint off the old photo frame on the wall. Her mother crouched beside a wounded foal, her calm expression saying without words, "It's okay to hurt. I'm here." That night, Clara brought the journal to the porch. Ghost opened his eyes at the sound of the door, but didn't rise. He looked at her not with suspicion, but with a question. "Are we being quiet together again tonight?" Clara sat down beside him, still holding the journal. She didn't speak. She didn't pick up the harmonica. She simply extended her hand, without touching Ghost, just letting it rest open, palm down on the ground, ready to receive. And softly, Ghost lifted his head and gently laid his chin on her knee. No sound. No reward awaited him. No command called him to move. Only presence, whole, honest, and allowed to simply be. And in that moment, Clara understood what her mother had once written with unwavering faith. Trust is not built with words. It grows in the silence where two hearts choose not to run from each other. That morning dawned with a light as soft as mist, casting a gentle gold over the wooden porch, across the dirt path leading to the fields, and onto the gray fur of Ghost, who now sat quietly, gazing into the distance, where Clara had just closed her mother's journal after a long night reading beneath a kerosene lamp. Something had shifted. Not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable. A kind of peace had begun to soak into legs once built only for running and clawing, slowly softening the edges that fear had once sharpened. Ghosts no longer hid in the shadows of trees. He stayed near the porch, watching Clara as if she spoke the only language he understood, the kind without words, without commands, only presence delivered at the right time, in the right way. But then the sound of an engine, dry and harsh, cut through the stillness like a stone dropped into a glassy pond. It wasn't Doctor, Monroe's truck, nor any vehicle familiar to the farm. The noise had a familiarity that brought unease like footsteps once associated with held breath in cold concrete kennels. Ghost froze. Ears were sharp, eyes darkened, his body tensed like a bowstring pulled tight, ready to spring to a familiar hiding place. But this time, he didn't run. He stood his ground, bracing himself as though a ghost from the past was materializing in broad daylight. A dark gray SUV pulled up just outside the gate. The dust hadn't even settled before the door opened. A tall man stepped out. Broad shoulders, purposeful stride, the gait of someone who didn't wait. He wore a dark leather jacket, held a thin folder in one hand, and scanned the gate with the disinterest of someone who only cared about one thing. "Clara Thompson?" he asked. His voice was deep and dense, sharp like steel long whetted. Clara stepped out from the porch. The wind lifted her hair across her face, but her gaze remained steady. She nodded. "I'm Lucas Boyd, former head trainer for Project ARC-17, the facility where this dog was conditioned. His designation was K-17. I'm here to take him back." Ghost had stepped forward beside Clara, silently, like the wind. He didn't bark, didn't growl, but his eyes were taut with alertness, and each step was deliberate, as if walking across his memories, forced to face something he never wanted to revisit. Clara asked, voice calm and firm, "On what basis do you claim the right to take him?" Lucas lifted the folder. "Authorization from the previous managing organization. He's classified military property, trained under a specialized budget, with one of the highest response indexes we've ever recorded, and more importantly, you, a minor, have no legal certification or authority to retain a specialized unit like this." Clara didn't look at the papers. She looked at Ghost, standing beside her, head slightly lowered, tail held firm, but not tucked. Then she turned back and said, word by word, "The dog you call K-17 doesn't exist anymore. Ghost has chosen to stay, and I don't need a permit to be trusted." Lucas scoffed. "You talk as if it has a choice. He's a product of reflex conditioning. Believe me, I've programmed dozens like him. He's just reacting according to a familiar model." Clara stilled. Then, in that quiet beat, Ghost stepped forward, not to attack, not to growl, but to stand between her and Lucas. Lucas looked down at him. "What's this? You trying to stop me?" Ghost didn't move, but his posture made the whole world pause. The way he positioned himself, not too high, not too low, just enough to shield Clara, was the clearest wordless answer. "I am no longer your tool." From inside the house, Miriam stepped out. She looked Lucas directly in the eye and asked, "What gives you the right to reclaim the life of a creature you discarded like trash?" Lucas clenched his jaw, but held out the folder again. Miriam didn't take it. She said, "You don't need documents to prove his past. His body bears all the evidence." Clara whispered, eyes still on Ghost. "But his heart doesn't belong to that past anymore." Lucas glanced at them all, then back at Ghost. After a moment, he slid the folder back into his case. "You'll regret letting emotion overrule judgment. With dogs like this, one loud bang is all it takes to shatter everything you think you've built." Ghost didn't flinch. Lucas turned and walked away, tossing his last words like a blade. "This isn't over." His car pulled away, leaving behind a long trail of dust, like the shadow of a nightmare just awakened from dormancy. Clara sat beside Ghost. Her hand rested lightly on his back. He breathed slowly, very slowly. But this time, instead of stiffening, his body trembled faintly, not in fear of the man, but in fear that he might still become what that man once made him. Clara didn't try to reassure him. She simply whispered, just loud enough for the wind to carry, "I'm still here." The morning after Lucas Boyd's departure left behind a silence like the residue of a storm. Ghost remained on the porch for a long time, eyes fixed on the spot where the SUV had once stood. No one spoke. Clara didn't ask what Ghost was thinking, nor did she try to pull him from his quiet. She simply brought out a worn cushion, sat beside him, and reopened her mother's journal, reading aloud in a calm, everyday tone. He didn't need to be pulled forward. He just needed someone to stay beside him long enough for him to decide to rise. Miriam, who had always let Clara walk her path, called her into the kitchen for the first time since Ghost arrived. On the table lay a thin folder, materials from the upcoming Sage Valley Autumn Fair, the region's annual event featuring farm tools, livestock showcases, folk games, and special performances. Miriam laid the registration form gently on the table. "Is this something you want to do?" Her voice was firm, but gently probing. Clara met her eyes, with no hesitation. "I'm not doing it to win, or to prove anything. I just want people to see who Ghost is." Her grandmother studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Lucas may come back. With lawyers, with press, with fear on his side." Clara replied, voice low but clear, "I'm not training Ghost to do anything. I'll just be beside him. If they can't believe in that, that's okay too." That weekend, Clara brought the form to the town hall. The clerk at the desk chuckled when he read her act title, "A Silent Duet Between a Girl and a Dog." But when he saw the name Clara Thompson, and beneath it Miriam Thompson as guardian, his smile softened. That surname still carried weight in town. From that day on, Clara did not rehearse for the performance. She issued no commands, called no tricks, and gave no tests. The days passed like music without melody, yet with a rhythm all their own, steady and real. Each morning, she read aloud to Ghost. Passages from her mother's notes or The Soul of the Dog, a book Eliza had once loved. Clara's voice didn't rise or perform. It simply filled the quiet space between the wind and the early fallen yellow leaves. Each afternoon, she sat under the birch tree where Ghost liked to rest. Every time, she placed her harmonica in her open palm. Not to play, just to be there. And Ghost, wherever he was, always wandered over. Not for the music, but as if to check. "Are you still here?" And so the days rolled forward. No drills, just building. No orders, just trust growing like a green shoot cracking through hard soil. Dr. Monroe continued her weekly visits. She never asked about Lucas. She simply made notes in her journal every time Ghost lay beside Clara without hesitation or stepped onto the porch unprompted. One day she smiled and said, "There are things you can't measure with leashes or treats. You can't command them either. They only appear when someone's patient enough to sit in silence." Clara understood then. She wasn't trying to prove Ghost was safe. She was trying to show the world that there is another way to live beside a wounded soul, not by managing pain, but by coexisting with it without fear. Ghost, with footsteps light as mist and eyes that saw past all armor, had never followed commands. But he had begun to wait for Clara, to walk with Clara, and sometimes just to stand beside her with no reason but presence. The Sage Valley Autumn Fair was approaching. Flags were being hung along Main Street, and booths selling pies, fruit, and handmade crafts sprouted like mushrooms after rain. The list of acts was posted on the town bulletin board, and near the bottom, among hunting dog routines and draft horse parades, one small line read, "Clara Thompson, a silent symphony with Ghost." No one knew exactly what would happen during that act, but those who had seen the girl sitting beside the large gray dog saying nothing, playing notes as fragile as the wind, began to understand that some performances didn't need a stage to touch the heart. Clara hadn't taught Ghost how to bow, but every time she stepped into the yard, he stopped to look at her, waiting, as if to ask, "Where are we going today?" And she always answered with her eyes, "As long as you stay." On the morning of the Sage Valley Fair, the air seemed to slow by a beat. The sky stretched higher than usual, brilliant but not harsh, and the ribbons strung across flagpoles swayed gently in the breeze, as if they, too, were waiting for something. The scent of pumpkin pie and buttered popcorn filled the main square, crowded with hundreds from neighboring towns. But amid the bustling noise, there was one space where everything began to quiet. Hands paused mid-sip of hot cocoa. Eyes turned toward the main arena gate. The name Clara Thompson and Ghost rang softly over the loudspeaker. No cheers. No whistles like the acts before. Just silence, spreading like ripples across a still pond after a breath of wind. And into that silence, a girl stepped out. Brown hair tied back, dusty sneakers, a dark, worn coat with frayed pockets. Clara wore no costume. She brought no leash, no name tag, no commands, just herself. And beside her, a living presence walked in quiet rhythm, his shadow falling alongside hers, steady as breath. Ghost entered the arena like water soaking into the grass, making no sound, drawing no attention with flashy moves but impossible to ignore. He didn't trail behind. He didn't lead. He walked level with Clara's shoulder, a small but powerful signal. He was not being pulled. He was not pulling. He was walking with her. No one in the audience spoke. Even the judges, used to seeing dogs leap through flaming hoops, roll on cue, or perform with clockwork precision, hesitated to write anything. There was something in Ghost's eyes that made training manuals feel foreign. Clara reached the center. She didn't look at the crowd, didn't seek out the cameras. She simply stopped, reached into her coat pocket, and pulled out an old metal object, the weathered harmonica of her mother, tarnished by time, still bearing the faint engraving, E.H. She brought it to her lips but didn't play immediately. She bowed her head gently, not clearly to anyone. Maybe to her mother, maybe to Ghost, maybe to some invisible faith she'd waited her whole life to grow quiet enough to hear. Then the first note floated out, so fragile that a stronger gust might have swept it away. A simple tune, not a song anyone recognized, not designed to impress, just like breathing, like someone calling out the name of something once lost. And in that breath of music, Ghost stopped, not because he was told to, but because he chose to. His legs tucked beneath him, chest settling softly to the ground, and his head, the same head once lowered only to bite, to attack, to survive, tilted toward Clara, then gently rested against her ankle. No one spoke. No one applauded. There were no cues, no signs of a successful routine. Only a living being, once defined as a tool, now lying still in the complete presence of a girl who had never asked him to be anything but himself. The crowd held its breath, and in that collective stillness, the most important thing happened. Ghost did nothing. He stayed, and for those who understood what that meant, that moment was more beautiful than any ring of fire or synchronized trick. Clara played a few more notes. The melody didn't build. No crescendo. Just enough to remind Ghost that she was still there. Then she lowered the harmonica, her hand resting naturally on the back of Ghost's neck. Ghost closed his eyes, not from exhaustion, not for reward, but because he felt safe. Somewhere in the stands, a child leaned toward her mother and whispered, "I think that dog is sleeping." The mother smiled and nodded quietly. "Yes, because he doesn't have to guard his fear anymore." And as the afternoon light slanted gently across the arena, without anyone shouting, without percussion, without thunderous applause, there remained only the quiet presence of a girl, a dog, and a piece of music no one could remember, yet no one would ever forget. As the last note of the harmonica faded, the arena fell into a stillness so deep it was as though no sound had ever existed. Ghost remained beside Clara, his head resting on her leg, not in triumph, but in quiet permission to finally do what he had long yearned for, to be close to someone without fear. Clara didn't bow. She didn't leave the ring quickly. She simply laid a gentle hand on Ghost's neck, a silent thank you, unspoken but complete. The crowd stayed where they were, many unmoving, not out of shock, but out of reverence, as though speaking now would shatter something too delicate to name. But then, the loudspeakers crackled. A man's voice came through, deep, even, and cold, each word sharpened like it had been cut from steel. And now, the most anticipated performance of today, the lead sponsor of the Sage Valley Fair, Mr. Benedict Cross. The announcement rippled through the crowd, not with excitement, but with a sudden stiffness, as if an unfamiliar wind had slipped through the trees. The main gate slowly opened. Benedict entered with a measured, frigid grace. Every step is deliberate, practiced, the gait of a man used to being in control. His long black coat fell neatly to his knees, leather gloves smooth, silver tie gleamed in the sunlight. Every part of him polished, but in that perfection, there was a hollowness no warmth could reach. Behind him came two trainers in black uniforms. Between them, restrained by taut leashes, was a large German shepherd, thin-ribbed, pale black fur, eyes burning gold like forgotten fire. This was Bramble. He didn't walk of his own will. He was pulled. The leash bit into his shoulders. Around his neck, a shock collar blinked with a red light. Subtle, but unmistakable. The air changed instantly. Children at the edges of the arena clutched their parents' arms. A few adults frowned, and those who had just witnessed Clara's performance could already feel the jarring contrast. Benedict raised a wireless mic. His voice rolled out smooth and rehearsed. This dog you see was once deemed uncontrollable, rejected by 5 separate facilities, bit 3 handlers, scheduled for termination. But we don't believe in failure. We believe in systems, in discipline, in structure, and in timely intervention. As he finished, a click rang out. Sharp. Bramble jolted. His body seized like something inside had twisted tight. A soft pulse of electricity had surged through the collar. His neck twitched. He snarled, but his eyes no longer saw the arena. They saw metal, blood, and panic. A trainer slammed a plastic baton against the ground beside Bramble. The dry snap echoed like punishment. Bramble howled. Not loud, but raw. Those who knew the sound of true panic recognized it instantly. This wasn't performance. This was a public re-traumatization. Benedict stood still, unblinking, as if all was going exactly to plan. He turned to the crowd and continued, voice calm and patronizing. No one wants to do this. But without control over wild instinct, the freedom you celebrate becomes a threat. What we do is for their safety. And yours. Another shock. Bramble didn't howl this time. His eyes reddened, his lip curled, saliva thick. He stood rigid, not to act, but because every nerve had been forced into a defense posture. And at that moment, across the arena, Ghost stood. No command told him to. Clara didn't stop him. He moved, step by step, soft as dew but heavy with purpose. The entire grandstand seemed to hold its breath. One trainer flinched, preparing to intercept. But Ghost's eyes, steady as stone, dark as a night that listens, made the man hesitate. His fingers tightened, but he didn't move. Ghost stopped a few paces from Bramble. He bowed his head slightly, lowered his tail, dropped his body to a calm crouch. No aggression, no dominance, not a signal taught by any school, just a quiet gesture. A presence shaped by shared pain, a way of saying, I understand. Bramble froze, his chest rising and falling rapidly, not growling, not barking, but something in his eyes shifted. For the first time since entering the arena, he didn't resist. He didn't try to flee, he simply stood still. Ghost lay down fully, front legs extended, his gaze never leaving Bramble. And Bramble, trembling, confused, torn between defensive instinct and a feeling he had never known, slowly lowered himself as well. Not smoothly, not steadily, but unmistakably by choice. For the first time in his life, not driven by fear. Benedict watched, lips tightening. He raised the microphone, ready to speak, but no words came out, because even if he refused to believe it, no one in the audience could deny the truth. With no commands, no interference, no control devices, two dogs once labeled problems, threats, failures, had found each other through nothing but presence. And in that presence, every structure Benedict had built from fear began to crack. Not loudly, not violently, but in a way no one could ignore. When Ghost's gaze met Bramble's, the entire space seemed to contract into a shared breath no one dared to break. No loudspeakers, no voiceover, no clicker sounds, no further shocks. Just a thick, palpable silence, stretching long enough for people to realize that what was happening was no longer a performance, but a meeting of two fractured souls finding their way back to one another. Ghost, after a still pause, began to walk forward, slowly. Every step seemed measured with the experience of a being who had lived in fear. There was no move to dominate or control. Ghost didn't push past anyone, didn't cut through anything. He approached along a subtle arc, as if to say, "I'm not here to touch, just to be present." Bramble froze. His body stiffened like a branch caught mid-swing by the wind, still unable to believe things were truly calming down. The shocks, the sticks, the shouted commands, the tension, they were all still rooted somewhere in his chest, ready to spring. But Ghost did nothing. He didn't make eye contact, didn't growl, didn't invite. He simply lay down, slowly, patiently, right in front of Bramble, placing himself in the lowest, most unguarded, most defenseless position. And that was exactly what began to unnerve Bramble. No one forced him to do anything. No vibrating collar, no commands, no pain is used as bait. Just another creature, peacefully lying there, not challenging, not pitying, just being there, unconditionally. Bramble tilted his head. His ears drooped slightly, his eyes flickered around, but his breathing began to slow. The twitches at his hips eased. The tension in his shoulders softened, settling into the awkwardness of a being experiencing something unfamiliar, being left in peace. He looked at Ghost, then, slowly, hesitantly, Bramble took half a step forward. No one knew what held him back after that first step, but the hesitation itself was stunning in its beauty because it showed he was choosing, not obeying, not reacting from fear, but choosing with a will that was fragile, uncertain, but real. And then, on the third breath of wind, Bramble lay down, right beside Ghost, not touching, but close enough that their bodies lay in quiet parallel, separated only by a thin strip of dust on the ground. Ghost didn't move. He didn't look over, because looking at that moment would have been too much. Some things are only meant to be felt in silence. The crowd seemed to have been drained of all sound. No one took pictures. No one whispered. No one even thought about judging what was happening. A child pressed her lips together and clutched her mother's sleeve. A middle-aged man, a veteran dog trainer, bowed his head gently as if just realizing he'd misunderstood something for years. Benedict Cross stood at a distance, hand clenched around the shock controller in his coat pocket, but unable to press it. Deep down, he knew. One wrong move, one more reflex, and everything would collapse. Not just the training program, but trust, credibility, the image he'd spent decades building through reputation and control. Clara remained at the edge of the field, where the sunlight fell diagonally through the trees. She didn't step forward, didn't call a name. She simply reached into her pocket and pulled out a harmonica, resting it in her palm. A quiet reminder that sometimes it isn't music that heals everything, but the silence between two notes, where a broken creature takes its first breath without fear. Ghost closed his eyes. Bramble did not. But his eyes no longer twitched, no longer strained. He looked forward, not with menace, not with judgment, but as if searching. Can this moment last a little longer? And in that silence, between two creatures once labeled dangerous, uncontrollable, and beyond saving, the clearest truth was this: they didn't need saving. They just needed someone to believe they were worth staying with. The silence blanketing the field felt like a thick fog, not from cold, but from something warmer, a feeling no one could name, yet everyone recognized. In the middle of the arena, two dogs lay side by side, Ghost and Bramble, both once called dangerous, unstable, and beyond redemption. But now, under hundreds of eyes, beneath unspoken applause held back in breath, they did nothing, just lay there quietly, as if their shared presence was the deepest connection words could never reach. Clara stood at the edge, her hand resting gently on the weathered harmonica. That little instrument had once been the only thing left after the accident that took her mother, a woman Clara remembered through the scent of peppermint oil, the slant of her handwriting in old journals, and the quiet nights when music was the only language Clara had to survive in a world not built for her. A gentle autumn breeze drifted through the trees around the fairground, sweeping dry leaves past her shoes. Clara's eyes were steady, not trembling, not afraid, just still, like a lake before the wind, calm enough to reflect the things others kept hidden. She didn't wait for a cue, didn't look for approval. She lifted the harmonica to her lips, the motion so familiar it seemed reflexive. But this time there was no urgency. No need to impress, no one to convince. The song didn't begin for a performance. It began for Bramble. The first sound rose like a breath, unclear, fragile, but enough to make the silent crowd realize that something delicate had just been released into the air. The melody had no steady beat, no catchy chorus, just a series of long, soft notes sliding past each other like threads in the wind, guided by a quiet, smoldering faith. Ghost didn't react. He knew this song. To Ghost, it wasn't music. It was proof that Clara was still here, still herself. But this time, Clara's gaze wasn't on Ghost. She stood still, eyes looking far away, but every note she played seemed to pour directly into the chaos inside another creature. The one still lying beside Ghost, still breathing hard, but no longer growling, recoiling in fear. Bramble. He didn't understand the melody, didn't know what trust meant, but he recognized tones that didn't touch fear. And for Bramble, that was a monumental start. He didn't get up, didn't move forward, but something in his eyes softened, his shoulders sank a little more, and his breathing, once jerky and panicked, began to synchronize with the drifting notes of the music. A child in the front row whispered to her mother, "Mommy, the dog is listening." The mother nodded silently and gently stroked her child's hair, as if trying to keep the moment from slipping away too fast. In the middle rows, a retired K9 handler, with calloused hands and eyes that had seen too many dogs fall under bad commands, sniffled softly. No one noticed, but he unclipped a training collar from his wrist and held it tightly in his palm. Meanwhile, Bramble, a creature once writhing under electric shocks, clicker strikes, leather-choked commands, now no longer flinched at the sound. No one commanded. No one was coerced. And for the first time since stepping into the field, he chose to lie still. Not out of exhaustion, not from defeat, but because someone was speaking to him in a way he'd never heard before, with a sound that didn't seek control. Ghost turned his head. Not fully, just enough for his gaze to meet Bramble's. No invitation, no comfort, just eye-level recognition between survivors. Clara kept playing. The melody didn't climax, didn't fall into cliches. Each note turned like a soft key in a rusted lock, where the heart of a creature, trained only to fear, was slowly relearning how to beat freely. Bramble shifted slightly. His flank brushed against Ghost's. Ghost didn't move, but his tail gave a faint wag like wind brushing a field after rain. The crowd barely breathed. Some held their breath. Some raised their phones, then lowered them again, sensing that recording might damage something too raw, too real, too alive. And in that silence, the song ended. No crisp cutoff, no final applause. Just a last lingering note, held a second longer, as if Clara wanted to keep the connection alive, then faded. The stands remained quiet. Ghost stayed down. And Bramble, no longer red-eyed, still beside Ghost, raised his head slightly and looked at Clara. No guard, no confusion, just a look of acceptance. And in that look, he seemed to say what no one had ever heard from him. If I could choose, I would choose to stay. As the last note of music faded into the wind like a soft breath, no one in the audience spoke. But everyone knew they had just witnessed something they couldn't look away from. Ghost and Bramble remained there, not because anyone commanded them, not by order, but simply because someone had listened long enough for their defenses to become unnecessary. Clara didn't bow. She didn't walk toward the spotlight. She quietly stepped back from the arena, placing her hand on Ghost's back like a whisper left unsaid. And in that exact moment, the phones, seemingly forgotten in pockets, began to stir. Videos were recorded, not with professional angles, nor sensational titles, just brief clips capturing a girl playing harmonica on brown dirt, while two dogs once deemed failures now lay peacefully together as if they had never known leashes. Within hours, the first video surfaced on a small animal training forum, then on a dog lovers page, then in a group for parents of children with Down syndrome. By the end of the day, social media timelines were flooded with a simple yet resounding phrase: the girl and the two dogs. Over 1 million views in 36 hours. Clips showing the exact moment Bramble recoiled, then slowly lay down beside Ghost, were shared tens of thousands of times, accompanied by captions like "healing without commands," "trust without leashes," or simply, "she didn't tame them, she listened." But while the internet was still caught up in emotion, somewhere else, where seasoned hands knew how to spin sentiment into tools, a counter-strategy had quietly begun. Benedict Cross, though silent at the fairground, hadn't left empty-handed. He had witnessed the entire event, and understood clearly that what had just occurred carried more influence than any speech he had ever given. And when emotion turns into public opinion, what he possessed, money, power, and a seasoned media team, could be used to bend the tide. Just one day after the video reached 2 million views, an article titled "Profile of a Dangerous Dog Let Loose Among a Crowd" appeared on a major news site. The cover image was a blurry frame, cut from old footage of Ghost caged at the Hollow Creek auction, bared teeth, bloodshot eyes, white froth at his mouth. In the article, an unnamed expert, quoted without revealing identity, stated, "This dog still exhibits strong attack reflexes. Allowing such an animal to roam freely around children is irresponsible." That same day, more posts began circulating. Clipped segments spliced together, showing only Ghost growling, howling, red-eyed, without context, without cause, without surrounding behavior. One video even had threatening sound effects added. New hashtags appeared. Unstable dog. Ignored danger. The initial reaction was confusion. People unfamiliar with the full story began sharing the warning. Some asked, "What if it bites someone? Why let a girl with Down syndrome stand alone between two big dogs? Is the media romanticizing a real danger?" And Benedict, the one orchestrating the entire campaign, stayed out of public view, appearing only through polished photos in anonymous interviews, where he emphasized concerns over emotion overwhelming safety, and a viral video isn't enough to judge a dog once rejected by a professional training unit. At Thompson's farm, Clara didn't read the news. She had no social media and didn't know the world outside was arguing about her. But Miriam knew. She got a call from a friend in town. "They're twisting the story. There's edited video now." That evening, all three, Miriam, Clara, and Dr. Monroe, sat around the old wooden kitchen table, warm light casting soft shadows on thoughtful faces. Ghost lay beneath Clara's feet. Bramble rested by the fireplace, his head on a worn blanket, a sign that he no longer saw himself as a stranger. Monroe placed her phone on the table, screen open to a manipulated video. Ghost snarled inside a cage, eyes wild, overlaid with heavy, ominous music. "This is distortion," she said, voice low but firm. "They're spinning the story the other way, and they know how to move fast." Clara didn't speak. She simply looked at Ghost. Not afraid, not sad, just calmly, as if she had expected this all along. "What do you think?" Miriam asked, worry deep in her tone. Clara gently stroked Ghost's back, then placed her hand on Bramble, for the first time since he arrived. Neither dog moved. The stillness is too deep to be a coincidence. "We don't need to prove anything," she said. "We just need to keep going." And in that moment, everyone in the wooden kitchen understood. No matter how loud the media storm, it couldn't erase what had truly happened. That trust didn't need explanation in words, but was made real in every synchronized breath between two beings who once knew only fear and still chose to stay, simply because someone had waited long enough for them to return. The next morning, as soft sunlight slipped through the early mist, scattering golden streaks over damp grass, Clara was already awake. She sat beneath the apple tree at the far end of the farm, where Ghost and Bramble often lay together during peaceful mornings, her mother's notebook on her lap, the harmonica still tucked quietly in her jacket pocket. Beside her, Ghost rested his head on his front paws, eyes half closed. And Bramble, once curled tight in silence, now lay on his side, back turned slightly toward the human he still hadn't touched, but no longer avoided. By the old wooden fence, a boy stood quietly. Jasper, a 10-year-old from the farm across the road, quiet, rarely smiling, and even less likely to venture outside when dogs were around. Over a year ago, a seemingly minor accident left a deep shadow. Bitten on the hand while playing with a neighbor's dog. Though the wound healed and the skin no longer ached, his small hand still trembled whenever a shaggy form brushed past his vision. Not because of the bite, but because, in that moment, the idea had taken root, that something familiar could betray you in a flash. He had avoided looking toward the Thompson farm, where everyone now knew two large dogs lived, one once labeled dangerous, the other recently rescued. But after the fair, once the video of Clara and the dogs spread through town, his class buzzed with chatter. Some brought clipped newspaper stories, including a photo of Ghost lying next to Bramble under the headline, "Not training, but trust." Jasper said nothing, but that afternoon he quietly rode his bike to Clara's fence, stood behind the bushes, and peeked through the gap, just to watch. The first day, then the second. No one called to him. No one chased him away. When Miriam noticed, she simply poured another cup of tea. Clara, as if she had known all along, kept to her same routine, reading under the apple tree, letting Ghost and Bramble choose their distance, and only playing harmonica when the evening light turned golden on the hills. Jasper watched, at first from far, hidden in leaves, then closer, crouched by the fence, until one evening, as Clara played, Bramble, the dog who once growled at the sound of footsteps, stood, walked to her, sat, then lay down, resting his head on her leg like a child learning to sleep without curling into himself. Jasper said nothing, but his hand gripped the fence tightly. The next morning, Miriam found a small paper cup left on the porch. Inside were a few dog treats and a folded note. She opened it. The handwriting was clumsy and shaking, but readable. "Does Bramble like softer food? I can leave it near the fence?" No signature, but she recognized the writing. Jasper. From that day, a new paper cup appeared each morning, sometimes with bits of chicken, sometimes a folded old towel, sometimes a bundle of dried grass tied with string. Clara didn't take them away. She simply placed them near Bramble's water bowl and let him decide whether to accept. 3 days later, Bramble nudged the cup closer, ate a piece, then lay down beside it. That evening, Jasper didn't hide. He stepped past the fence, still at a safe distance but no longer behind the apple tree. Clara looked up and met his gaze. She didn't speak. She raised the harmonica to her lips and played a short, gentle tune, a wordless greeting. Ghost stood and walked slowly toward Jasper. Not too close, just a few steps away, lifted his head to look. Jasper stood still. His hand trembled slightly, eyes fixed on the ground, but he didn't step back. Clara stopped playing. She smiled softly. Not an invitation, not an expectation, just presence, steady and patient. If the boy needed another day, a week, or a month, someone would be there, waiting. And that, for Jasper, was something he had never been given before. The right to choose, and the right to be trusted, even while still afraid. That afternoon, Bramble had calmly walked up to Jasper, not hurriedly, not hesitantly, and without any prompting. He simply made his way to where the boy sat on a small rock, paused in front of him, and lay down, his head resting near Jasper's feet, as if entrusting something beyond what human language could express. And Jasper, once haunted by the trauma of an unexpected bite, just sat still, arms relaxed at his sides, eyes unblinking, then leaned ever so slightly toward Bramble, as if he too was learning how to trust the breath of a creature once labeled dangerous. Clara watched from a distance, not interfering. She understood that moment didn't need a witness, only a quiet presence. Ghost lay beneath the apple tree, eyes half open, his gaze calm as always. But something in his expression had softened, like an old teacher slowly nodding as a former student discovered something new. But peace never stays long once we begin to treasure it. That night, as dark clouds rolled over the roof and the wind hissed through the wooden fence, the damp scent of earth filled the air. Miriam pulled the kitchen curtain and murmured, "A storm's coming." Clara stood near the fireplace, checking the blanket wrapped around Bramble, who was curled in the corner. Outside, Ghost lay on the porch, the same spot he chose every night, not coming inside, yet never far away. Then the sound came. Fireworks. No one knew who in town decided to set off fireworks on a stormy night, but the first explosion cracked across the valley like an artificial thunderclap, sharp and brutal. Clara jolted. Bramble leaped up, retreating under the table, and Ghost, he didn't howl, bark, or whimper. He simply sprang up like a pulled bowstring, eyes wide, back tensed, and bolted into the night without a sound. "Ghost!" Clara cried, rushing barefoot onto the cold porch. But Ghost had vanished into the rain-soaked wind. He didn't look back. Miriam called all over town, but Clara didn't wait. She grabbed her thin coat, stuffed the harmonica into her pocket, took a flashlight, and was just stepping out the door when a small voice rose from the other side of the gate. "I'm coming too." Jasper, drenched in an oversized raincoat, flashlight strapped to his chest, stood there, hands trembling slightly but eyes filled with resolve. He didn't ask. He didn't seek permission. He only knew one thing. Ghost had been there when Bramble began to learn how to trust, and now it was his turn. They went. Into the cold, misty rain, through muddy roads, the sound of rustling leaves and sporadic fireworks echoing behind like aftershocks. Clara led flashlight scanning tree trunks and muddy footprints, her eyes taut with tension. Jasper followed closely, silently sweeping his light across the low bushes, watching for any familiar movement. They called for Ghost, not loudly, not frantically, just as a whisper. Clara paused at every clearing, took out her harmonica, and played short, broken melodies. Fragments like coded signals meant only for Ghost. There was no reply. The cold wind lashed their faces. Mud clung to the hems of their clothes. But Clara didn't stop. She knew Ghost's fear didn't come from the fireworks themselves, but from the memory tied to that sound, where fear had once been a tool used against him. If Ghost didn't return, it wouldn't be because he was lost, but because he believed he wasn't allowed to come back. Their first stop was the pine forest behind the stables, where Ghost used to rest alone in the early mornings. Nothing but the sound of rain on leaves. The second was the field behind the hill, where Bramble first accepted Jasper's offering. Empty. By midnight they reached the forest's edge, where trees thickened and darkness began to swallow light. Clara sank to her knees, clothes soaked. She brought the harmonica to her lips, this time not in broken notes. She played fully, slowly, in a low tone, almost whispering into the wind. It was no longer a song, but a gentle call. No words, no tone, just breath-carrying memory. And within the dense curtain of darkness, among the wet woods, came a faint sound, a twig snapping under someone's step. Jasper's eyes lit up in the dark, and his flashlight swung and stopped. Between two trees, silver eyes glimmered. Then the familiar figure of Ghost appeared. Back slightly arched, front paws muddy, chest heaving. Clara didn't call. She played a few more notes, 3 simple, short tones, ending in one long breath. Ghost stepped forward. Then again. His eyes found hers. No anger, no fear, only hesitation, as if asking, "Am I allowed to return?" Jasper placed a hand on Clara's arm. "He didn't leave us," he whispered. "He just needed someone to wait longer than one night." The Ghost moved toward the light. Not hurried, but each step firm, as though he'd made his choice. That even if his heart still trembled, the home would be where someone had the patience to wait for him to stop running. When he rested his head at Clara's feet, just as he did at the fair, the wind quieted, the rain thinned, and inside the two children, one truth rang clearer than ever. Loss isn't as frightening as the thought that no one believes you can find your way back. In the fragile hush of the forest night, with the rain just past, dew clung to every leaf, and the earth remained soft and unsteady underfoot. Clara sat down on the damp ground, harmonica clutched in her lap. The scent of wet grass and bark mixed with the chill running down her spine. Beside her, Jasper stood silently, not asking, not speaking, just breathing steadily, eyes still fixed on the dim space where Ghost had appeared. Clara didn't call him. She didn't raise her voice, didn't open her arms, didn't beg as others had done to break Ghost into submission. Instead, she looked up through the trees, where moonlight, pushing through gray clouds, traced a faint silver edge along everything below, as if the moon itself was waiting for him to return. Then she raised the harmonica to her lips. The first note emerged, thin, delicate like silk, unclear in pitch, a stream of breath laced with simple, coarse sound. It was uneven, without rhythm, more like the voice of a heart that had stayed quiet too long, finally exhaling in melody. It wasn't a song for performance, not a practiced chorus. It was a memory in sound, of afternoons by a window, hearing her mother play lullabies for frightened animals, of wind carrying the harmonica's voice like soft heartbeats from a hand that never traded love for control. Ghost emerged slowly, not charging as he had the day they dragged him from his cage, not howling or growling like when Clara first locked eyes with him at the auction. He stepped past a low fern, muddy paws moving forward, head slightly lowered, eyes resting on the shadows of the two children waiting. Not fast, but wholly real. Clara saw him first, her gaze softened, and though her hands trembled as she played, the music flowed evenly, as if her breath had found a place to land. Ghost stopped a few steps away, not close, but near enough that Jasper's flashlight stretched across his damp fur. Jasper still hadn't spoken, but he stepped forward, slowly, carefully, the memory of the old wound, the moment a dog's eyes changed, the bark that ripped the air, the tearing of skin, still whispered in his thoughts. But now, before him, was Ghost. Not fierce, not guarded, just still, as if wondering, am I still trusted? Jasper stopped an arm's length away. He sat down, not pushing closer, and reached out his hand, palm up, just like Clara always did. A gesture without command, without force, just an invitation. Ghost tilted his head. He didn't approach but didn't retreat either. A soft breath escaped his chest, like an exhale long held back. And then, almost imperceptibly, he lowered himself, sitting before Jasper, head bowed, ears relaxed. Clara's harmonica still played gently behind them, now like the forest's heartbeat, steady, quiet, and trustworthy enough to need no protection. Jasper inhaled. His hand, still extended, moved slowly. When his fingertips touched Ghost's damp fur, he held his breath, not out of fear, but disbelief. The fur was wet, soft, and warm. Ghost didn't move, didn't flinch. He simply closed his eyes. No one spoke. No one broke the silence. Clara played 3 final notes, long and thin, then stopped. As the last breath faded, she lowered the harmonica, holding it in her hand, chest rising and falling with slow, even breaths. Ghost shifted toward Clara, resting his head lightly against her leg. Jasper pulled back, but not far. He kept his hand near Ghost for a few more seconds, as if to memorize the feeling. Something he hadn't dared imagine for years. Touching an animal without fear of betrayal. 3 souls, one girl carrying the sounds of memory, one dog once defined by fear, and one boy bearing silent scars, sat together under a moon breaking through the last of the clouds. The forest wind had calmed, leaving only droplets falling from leaf to soil, and the scent of wild grass quietly sinking into the air. Jasper turned to Clara, his eyes asking no question. Clara smiled. Not the smile of someone who achieved something great, but of someone who had just watched something fragile remain whole. And Ghost, he didn't understand human accidents, didn't know about memory, but in the way he sat there, without fleeing, without tension, was a kind of silent companionship only those once wounded could recognize in each other. That night, no one needed saving. They only needed to stay long enough and quiet enough to know this. Sometimes the softest sound is the one that leads to the lost home. When 3 figures, a girl, a dog who had once run off into the night, and a boy carrying old memories, returned from the deep forest the next morning, the first rays of sunlight had just begun to slip through the birch trees outside the porch, casting a quiet, warm light over the front yard like a wordless welcome. Miriam stood at the doorway, teacup in hand, asking nothing, only watching Clara with eyes full of wonder and an emotion too complex to name. Behind her, Bramble rose from his old blanket, lifting his head toward Ghost. He didn't bark, didn't run over. He just looked, recognizing that someone in the pack had returned and safety had been restored, even if no one said it aloud. From that morning on, something began to change. Not loudly, not with announcements, but like green shoots unexpectedly sprouting from soil thought long dead. The townspeople, who had first come out of curiosity after the viral video, now returned not to take photos, but to help build a new fence. Some brought hay, others delivered leftover lumber. A group of veterinary students called, asking if they could come observe. And an old woodcarver, once a friend of Clara's mother, quietly brought a wooden sign, the letters carved by hand, still rough but etched as if from memory. Hay's Kinship Sanctuary. Clara read the sign for a long time, not because her mother's name was unfamiliar, but because, for the first time, it wasn't attached to a lost past, but to something blooming, something her mother once dreamed of, and that Clara, unknowingly, had laid the first stone for through her silent listening. They never called it a training center. That word never quite fit. Here, there were no leashes, no shouting, no fenced-off sand pits, and no observation benches. Instead, it was built like an open garden. Trees left where they were to give shade. Long benches placed by a small stream where dogs and humans could sit together, and an old shed turned into a tiny library filled with the bound pages of Eliza Hayes' journals. Yellowed paper, but still clear words, each sentence a reminder. Obedience isn't the goal. It's the result of trust that isn't forced. Ghost was no longer a difficult case, but neither did he become a model dog in the conventional sense. He didn't follow commands on cue and didn't perform. He simply lived, true to the instincts of a creature once stripped of freedom, now allowed to breathe in a place where nothing was expected but honest presence. When new dogs arrived, abandoned, bred to fight, or chained in nameless backyards for years, the first being they saw wasn't a person, but a ghost. He didn't approach immediately. He stood at a respectful distance, far enough not to hurt, close enough not to turn away, the gaze of one who had walked through fire and knew that fearful creatures didn't need enthusiastic kindness, but steady quiet that wouldn't vanish when things got hard. Bramble, once trembling at every sound, now dared to nap in the sun. Some days he would pass by Jasper, leaving only a glance before moving on. Jasper never tried to pet him, never called out. He understood that with old wounds, being allowed to not be ready was its kind of healing. When the center was complete, there was no grand opening, no ribbons, and no cameras. Just a clear morning, with Miriam bringing baked scones out to the yard, Clara repositioning a few wooden chairs by the porch, and Dr. Monroe, like every Tuesday, pulling up in her beat-up pickup truck with a few bags of medicine and warm tea. They didn't say much, but when the wooden sign was hung by the gate, sunlight touching the surface, and the hand-carved letters seemed to breathe, Clara stood still for several seconds. A wisp of grass floated by. Ghost stood at the gate, watching it. He didn't bark, didn't chase. He simply stood as a silent guardian, not needing words, not seeking praise, only to ensure that every creature who entered would know. Here, no one has to change to be accepted. The wooden gate of Hayes Kinship Center had only been up for a week when one calm afternoon passed like any other. Gentle breeze weaving through the trees behind the backyard, sunlight casting soft golden strokes across the grass, and Ghost quietly patrolling along the fence line, like a sentinel without a title. Bramble, who usually stayed in the shade, had chosen a spot closer to the children, where Clara was guiding two young volunteers on how to read body language in dogs through nothing but eye contact and tail position. Jasper was playing alone a few dozen steps away, with a small remote-controlled car, an old toy Clara had once used for lessons on creating movement without triggering a reaction. In the sunlight, the boy no longer curled inward as he once did. He had begun to step farther from the adults, willing to sit in the open field without glancing around to see who might be watching. He rolled across the grass, chasing his car, giggling softly, a sound like a stream slipping over stones, quiet, but real and clear. Bramble lay a short distance away, head resting on his paws, ears perking up whenever the toy let out a soft beep. Then everything changed in a flash. The toy car sped too fast, bounced off the ground, and tumbled down a low embankment near the edge of the garden, where the grass grew tall and shadows gathered thick. Jasper ran after it. He didn't know that it was snake season, and though non-venomous, water snakes still awakened fear in children like a reflex. Clara was still talking at the far end of the wooden shed when she heard Jasper cry out, not loud, but tight and urgent. She spun around and sprinted through the grass, a cold pang rising in her chest with the instinctual dread that something wasn't right. But when she reached the edge of the ditch, the first thing she saw wasn't Jasper. It was Bramble, the once frightened dog, who used to cower at any fast-approaching footstep, was now standing firmly between Jasper and the grass. His hackles were raised, legs planted solidly, jaws tense but not growling, eyes locked on a shimmer of movement, something silver slithering in the brush. A water snake. Small, but enough to terrify Jasper. Bramble didn't attack. He didn't lunge as a fighting dog might. He just stood, like a living wall of flesh and blood, between danger and the boy. A body that once recoiled from fear now stood as a shield for someone more vulnerable. Clara skidded to a stop, but didn't step closer, not wanting to shatter the sacred moment between two trembling beings who, this time, chose not to run. The snake slithered away after a few seconds, vanishing under the leaves. And Bramble didn't move a muscle until he was certain the threat had passed. Only then did Jasper break into tears, but not from panic. It was a kind of bursting, gasping, staggering, as if every layer of ice that had closed around him over the years had been cracked open by something he never thought possible. A dog choosing to protect him. Not because it was trained to, but because it believed he was worth protecting. He threw his arms around Bramble's neck. He didn't scream, didn't call for his mom. He just held on, face buried in the sweat-dampened fur, small hands trembling. Not in fear, but in the deep knowing that, for the first time, he felt safe with an animal. Clara didn't interfere. She just knelt nearby, watching Bramble, whose eyes weren't on her, but on the sky, chest still rising and falling, but slower now. In the way he stood, holding that position without a single command, was a long journey of silence, of healing, and finally, of choice. When Jasper looked up, eyes still red, he whispered only one sentence. He stayed because of me. And Clara knew. That was Jasper's true beginning. Just as it was Bramble's first declaration to himself, I am no longer the one marked as dangerous. I am a protector. That afternoon, the sky was blanketed in soft, pillowy clouds, and the sunlight spread gently over the Sage Valley as the season drew to a close, like a quiet blanket laid over a landscape learning how to rest. On the lawn of the Hayes Kinship Center, Jasper and Bramble sat together beneath the apple tree, once the quietest corner of the grounds, now a sacred spot for souls who needed more time to trust a gentle touch. Clara watched them from a distance, still writing in her journal about the care of the newly arrived dogs, while Ghost lay not far off, his eyes half closed, as if guarding something fragile. A car's tires whispered over the dirt road leading to the front gate. Not fast, not loud, just a slow approach, like someone asking permission to enter a space designed for healing. Clara looked up. A charcoal gray SUV with unfamiliar plates, but a presence that felt hauntingly familiar, came to a stop at the gate. The man who stepped out was tall, reserved, dressed neatly in a button-up shirt, and holding a large brown envelope. He didn't look around, didn't stride in. He simply stood there, as though waiting for an invitation, even though his eyes revealed that he had come to deliver something that couldn't be left unsaid. "Caleb Cross," Miriam said softly, stepping onto the porch with a teacup still untouched in her hand. She didn't look surprised, nor did she seem cold. Her expression was that of someone who'd lived through enough years to know the difference between someone arriving empty-handed and someone carrying something heavier than words. Clara came forward to stand beside her. Ghost didn't move, but lifted his head, gaze steady on the stranger. No growl, no tension, just a calm awareness, as if sensing that something important was about to happen. Caleb walked closer, stopping a few steps away. He extended the envelope, fingers tightly gripping its edge. Creased, softened from being opened and closed more times than one could count. "It's from him," Caleb said, his voice low and hoarse. "My father. He wrote it in the last few weeks, before everything became too late to hold on to." No one asked a question. Clara only nodded gently and took the envelope, as if receiving something not quite hers, but now hers to safeguard. They didn't read it right away. Miriam invited Caleb to the porch. They had tea in silence. Only when the sun began to dip into the valley did Clara climb to the attic, where her mother once sat reading during rainy afternoons, where old harmonicas and yellowed notebooks lay tucked into hidden drawers. She sat by the window and opened the letter. The handwriting of Benedict Cross was trembling but still deliberate. Each word carried a struggle between a lifetime of control and a late-blooming need to say the one thing he had always avoided. "I'm sorry. Clara, if you're reading this, then your mother, Eliza, is probably smiling somewhere. Finally, someone in the Cross family has learned that trust cannot be forced, bought, or tested into existence. For so long, I thought I was training obedience. But what I received wasn't understanding. It was compliance shaped by fear. I broke Ghost, and nearly broke myself in the process. But then I saw that girl at the fair. No commands, no rewards or punishments, no need for control. And Ghost, the creature I believed I had stripped of all free will, stepped forward. He sat down. Because he chose to. I had never lost a game. Until Ghost stopped playing by my rules. And for the first time, I understood what it meant to be freed. Thank you, and thank Ghost, for teaching an old, stubborn man his final lesson. At the end was a legal transfer of land, over 20 acres west of the center, a place where spring meadows bloomed yellow and a stream cut through the field. A piece of property once held by Benedict, now passed on, not for building, but as a late act of redemption, to expand freedom itself. Clara folded the letter carefully. Her hands were steady, but her eyes misted. She understood. Not everyone changes in time, but some, even at the very end, still try to leave room for the ones they once failed. Ghost looked up at her from the yard below. When Clara came down the steps, she said nothing. She simply pulled the harmonica from her pocket, placed it to her lips, and played. A short, familiar tune. Old, simple, and just long enough to say, "Your apology arrived in time." While the ink on Benedict Cross's land transfer was still drying, and his letter of apology lay folded in the drawer with Clara's harmonicas, a quiet line of rescue trucks began to appear on the dirt road to Hayes Kinship. No sirens, no flashing lights, just old pickups with tarp-covered beds filled with the hushed sounds of fear. Not loud barking, but fragmented breaths, claws tapping on metal like hesitant heartbeats, still searching for a place safe enough to beat freely. Clara stood by the gate, clipboard in hand, eyes calm but steady, each breath already attuned to welcoming wounds in living form. Dr. Monroe arrived earlier than usual that week, bringing her stethoscope, healing salves, and a full tin of homemade chestnut biscuits. She knew that healing didn't start with needles. It started with the steady rhythm of repeated kindness. The dogs came from everywhere. Some from out-of-state shelters, marked unfit for contact. Some were from abandoned kennels, their bodies skin and bone, eyes clouded with fatigue. Others had been trained to fight, and now trembled at the sound of approaching footsteps. Each one arrived with a history that the world had already labeled, broken, hopeless, and not worth the effort. But at Hayes Kinship, there were no labels, only names and time. Ghost never had to be called. He always appeared when most needed, not as a leader, but as a quiet shadow who knew what it meant to be seen. When the truck doors opened, he didn't rush in. He stood a few paces behind Clara, ears relaxed, tail low, eyes fixed on the trembling animal inside as if to say, "I've been there, and I'm still here." Not every dog reacted like Bramble. Some barked, some shrieked, some curled into corners and wouldn't come out for weeks, but Ghost never demanded progress. He simply lay nearby, sometimes so far it looked like nothing. But he stayed. And then, one afternoon, one of the hardest dogs would inch forward, step by step toward where Ghost lay. Not to reach him, but just far enough to share the silence. No words ever accomplished what that moment could. Clara called it syntaxless connection, something born not from understanding, but from presence that stayed long and quietly enough. Bramble had changed, too. He started trailing Ghost around, learning how to sit beneath a tree without flinching at falling leaves. Sometimes he'd settle beside the new arrivals, still and breathing evenly, as if to say, "It's okay, no one is rushing us here." Jasper, more confident now, often read aloud with Clara outside. He liked to read passages from Eliza Hayes's journals, and sometimes he'd ask Ghost, "She wrote this for you, didn't she?" Ghost, as usual, didn't answer. But the tilt of his head and a slow wag were enough to make Jasper smile and keep reading. The new land Benedict left remained untouched. No kennels, no fences. Just open meadow, with a stream and a small hill that bloomed purple every sunset. It was there Ghost often led the newcomers, not to teach, but to show them that a world still existed beyond cages, where no one shouted, no one carried a whip, and no one asked them to be anything but themselves. One afternoon, Clara was writing in her journal. She flipped through the yellowed pages until she found a line. "Healing doesn't come when we say it's time. It comes when they say they're ready." She didn't write another word. She closed the notebook, stood, and walked out to the field, where Ghost lay among 3 new dogs, all 4 bodies quiet like resting coals in the golden light. And Clara knew. Her mother had been right. You don't have to shout for a soul to change. You just have to stay long enough and listen gently even after the world has stopped trying. That afternoon, as the last golden strands of sunlight stretched across the western meadow, where Ghost and 3 newly arrived dogs lay stretched out on the field of purple grass, a small group of veterinary students from the State University sat cross-legged on woven mats near the wooden porch of Hayes Kinship. No chairs, no tables, no blackboard. Just a girl with a notebook in hand and a dog lying beside her. Unleashed, uncommanded, simply present. Clara didn't walk out like a lecturer. She carried no pointer, wore no mic, and opened no curriculum. She simply sat down, resting her hand gently on Ghost's back, not to control or restrain, just to affirm, "I'm here, with you." A red-haired student raised her hand shyly. "What command do we begin with?" Clara smiled, her eyes drifting toward the meadow where Bramble had just emerged from the shade, wandering peacefully. "No commands at all. Here, we begin with silence." Some students furrowed their brows, some scribbled in their notebooks, but most simply sat quietly, not because they were told to, but because they sensed something here was different. Clara opened her small notebook, not to read, but to find a marked page where her mother once wrote in sharp, steady handwriting, "Touch can be permission, not possession." Then she looked up, her voice not loud, but calm and steady. "Touching an animal doesn't mean we own it. Sometimes a touch is just a request to stay close, and when they let us be there, that's the beginning of healing." Ghost didn't move, but he closed his eyes. A quiet period at the end of her sentence. Clara didn't speak in order. She didn't teach by outline. She simply told stories, as one who gathered scattered pieces of memory and stitched them into something alive. About that day at the auction, where a girl holding an old harmonica stood surrounded by laughter and skeptical eyes. About the first look Ghost gave her, not fearful, but ancient, as if he had known her long before they met. About the first night, he refused to come inside. The times he wouldn't eat, yet always lay close enough to hear her reading aloud. A male student near the edge of the circle asked quietly, "But what if he doesn't cooperate? What if we have to start therapy right away and they won't respond?" Clara didn't answer immediately. She looked down at Ghost, then back at the group. When a being refuses, it isn't rebellion. It might just mean they don't feel safe yet. In therapy, we can mend wounds, but we can't force a heart once broken to beat again on our schedule. The room, though outdoors, softened. It was no longer a class. It had become a listening circle where academic terms quietly stepped back, giving space for stories told in a voice with no drama, yet full of truth. Ghost opened his eyes. He didn't get up, just stretched his neck out to rest his head on Clara's leg. And in that moment, wordless, unprompted, everyone understood. They weren't being taught about training, they were learning about trust. Clara closed her notebook. No conclusion, no instructions, just the wind threading through the grass and Bramble's paws splashing quietly by the creek in the distance. Then she said, softly, not to anyone in particular, "I'm not here to teach. I'm here to tell a story. And if somewhere in that story you find a way to reach a wounded creature, then that's the greatest gift my mother ever gave me. And now, I'm passing it to you." That evening, as the last of the students departed the center, their eyes holding a kind of quiet that had no name, Clara didn't go inside. She stood under the tree where Ghost rested, as if she too needed a pause, not to reflect with words, but to fold the story back into herself with the breath of every scar that had healed through time and acceptance. The twilight sun receded slowly across the western fields, where late-season dandelion seeds floated like drifting memories. The new dogs, once trembling in corners, now ran freely through the purple grass, their paws stirring up golden dust, moving as if they had never known fear. Bramble trailed behind, not chasing, just walking at a steady pace, occasionally looking back like an older brother watching over the pack. Clara sat on the wooden porch steps. Ghost didn't need to be called. He rose from his resting place and came to lie beside her, resting his head gently on her leg. No words, just warmth, familiarity, a steady presence, like an old hill that had always stood quietly, not seeking attention, but never gone. Clara pulled from her coat pocket the old harmonica, the one that belonged to her mother, with the faded engraving E.H. The metal was smooth now, worn by time and repetition. She hadn't played since the fair, not out of fear, but because she was waiting for the right moment, when music was no longer performance, but became what it was meant to be, a whisper from someplace deep, only heard by those who truly listened. And now, at last, that moment had come. The sound rose softly, not loud, not distinct, just breath over metal. Fragile, simple, like the first words of a creature who had stayed silent for far too long. It wasn't a call, it didn't summon the dogs back. It simply existed, like a heartbeat sent into the air, for whoever needed it. And for those not yet ready, it permitted them to wait. Ghost lifted his head slightly, gazing at the distant shapes running in the sun. He didn't leave, but his body leaned a little more into Clara's, as if merging into the music, as if recognizing that this wasn't a song for comfort anymore. This was a song for memory. A breeze swept by, curling the hem of Clara's coat, dropping a single golden leaf onto the porch step. And when the final note dissolved into the air, she lowered her head, placed her hand gently on Ghost's head, and whispered so only he could hear, "I never made you change. I just waited long enough to hear what you needed." Ghost didn't flinch, didn't shift, but something in his eyes softened, a clarity like water that had once been stirred, now settling, still and true. Bramble wandered over and sat beside them, not intruding, just joining, as if his place there was inevitable. The other dogs began to gather too, not in lines, not by order, but drawn by a quiet gravity emanating from that one moment. Some lay down. Some stood still, ears tilted toward the silent harmonica. And in that last streak of sunlight falling from the edge of the clouds, the entire sanctuary seemed to hold its breath. No one spoke. No one called out. Yet every creature there, no matter how scarred, understood one thing. They had found the right place. Not because they had to change, but because they were allowed to exist exactly as they were. With their wounds, with their healing, with their silence, and with music meant only for those who had once heard the world turn away. And from that moment on, every sunset that passed over Sage Valley carried the echo of something unnamed. But anyone who had ever stepped foot in this sanctuary knew there is a place in this world where waiting becomes a miracle, and where a dog once labeled hopeless taught people how to truly listen again. As the final sunset closed the journey of Ghost, Clara, and Bramble, we witnessed not just the rescue of a dog, but the awakening of a community. In a place once thought to be the end of fear, wordless love became the key that unlocked the door to renewal. No commands, no control, just patience, and a heart quiet enough to listen. And what about you? Have you ever met a gaze, from an animal or a person, that made you realize sometimes just being there is enough? Share your story with us in the comments below. If this journey touched your heart, please like, share it with someone who needs a spark of hope, and subscribe to our channel to help us spread more stories of kindness and healing like this one. Because sometimes, the only thing you need to do is stay long enough to listen.